I I thought that I looked really cool today. I liked the way that my wig was, so I wanted to record a video, but I don't actually have any thing for a video, so I thought I'd do a live stream because I did a poll on Instagram a little while ago saying about how if I started reading books people would be interested, and most people said that this would be the thing that they'd want to watch it on, so here I am. I'm reading The Ghost Bride today. I've had this book for probably about 6 years and I've never read it, and I wanted to. My mum gave it to me and she said that I'd enjoy it, and it's just been kind of sitting in my to read pile since then, so I'm going to read it now. I will be uploading this video to my YouTube as well after I've done it, just so that you guys know. I'm going to actually get this up on here. Don't mind me. No, that's not what I wanted. Give me a second. There we go. Perfect. Okay. So, Ghost Bride. So, the description of the book is Malaya, 1893, Li Lan, the daughter of a genteel but bankrupt Chinese family, has few prospects, but fate intervenes when she receives a proposal from the wealthy and powerful Lim family. They want her to become a ghost bride for the family's only son, who died under mysterious circumstances. Rarely practiced, ghost marriages are often meant to placate a restless spirit. Such a union would guarantee Li Lan a comfortable home for the rest of her days, but at what cost? As she reluctantly considers the offer, Li Lan is unwillingly drawn into the shadowy parallel world of the Chinese afterlife, with its ghost cities and vengeful spirits. There, Li Lan must uncover the Lim family's darkest secrets and the truth about her own family before she is trapped in this ghostly world forever. This is for the person who's seeing. This is the book cover. It looks quite good. So let's start. It says, Part 1, Malaya, 1893. One evening, my father asked me whether I would like to become a ghost bride. Asked is perhaps not the right word. We were in his study. I was leafing through a newspaper, my father lying on his rattan daybed. It was very hot and still. The oil lamp was lit and moss fluttered through the humid air in lazy swirls. What did you say? My father was smoking opium. It was his first pipe of the evening, so I presumed he was relatively lucid. My father, with his sad eyes and skin pitted like an apricot kernel, was a scholar of sorts. Our family used to be quite well off, but in recent years we had slipped until we were just hanging on to middle-class respectability. A ghost bride, Li Lan. I held my breath as I turned a page. It was hard to tell when my father was joking. Sometimes I wasn't sure even he was entirely certain. He made light of serious matters, such as our dwindling income, claiming that he didn't mind wearing a threadbare shirt in this heat. But at other times, when the opium enveloped him in its hazy embrace, he was silent and distracted. It was put to me today, he said quickly. I thought you might like to know. Who asked? The Lim family. The Lim family was among the wealthiest households in our town of Malacca. Malacca was a port, one of the oldest trading settlements in the east. In the past few hundred years, it had passed through Portuguese, Dutch, and finally British rule. A long, low cluster of red-tiled houses, it straggled along the bay, flanked by groves of coconut trees and backed inland by the dense jungle that covered Malaya like a rolling green ocean. The town of Malacca was very still, dreaming under the tropical sun of its past glories when it was the pearl of port cities along the straits. With the advent of steamships, however, it had fallen into graceful decline. Yet, compared to the villages in the jungle, Malacca remained the epitome of civilization. Despite the destruction of the Portuguese fort, we had a post office, the Stadthuis City Hall, 2 markets and a hospital. We were in fact the seat of British administration for the state. Still, when I compared it to what I had read of the great cities of Shanghai, Calcutta or London, I was sure it was quite insignificant. London, as a district office once told our cook's sister, was the centre of the world, the heart of a great and glittering empire that stretched so far from east to west that the sun never set on it. From that far-off island, very damp and cold I heard, we in Malaya were ruled. But though many races, Malay, Chinese and Indian, with a sprinkling of Arab and Jewish traders, had settled here for generations, we kept our own practices and dress, and though my father could speak Malay and some English, he still looked to China for his books and papers. Never mind that it was my grandfather who left his native soil to make his fortune trading here. It was too bad that the money had dwindled under my father's hands. Otherwise, I don't think he would have considered the Lim family's offer. They had a son who died a few months ago, a young man named Lim Tian Ching. Do you remember him? Lim Tian Ching was someone I had seen perhaps once or twice at some festival. Apart from the name of his wealthy clan, he had left no impression at all. Surely he was very young, not much older than you, I believe. What did he die of? A fever, they say. In any case, he is the bridegroom. My father spoke carefully, as though he was already regretting his words. And they want me to marry him? Distracted, I knocked over the inkstone on his desk, its contents spilling onto the newspaper in an ominous black stain. This practice of arranging the marriage of a dead person was uncommon, usually held in order to placate a spirit. A deceased concubine who had produced a son might be officially married to elevate her status to a wife, or 2 lovers who died tragically might be united after death. That much I knew, but to marry the living to the dead was rare and indeed a dreadful occurrence. My father rubbed his face. He was once, so I was told, a very handsome man when he contracted smallpox. Within 2 weeks his skin became as thick as crocodile's hide and scarred with 1,000 craters. Once gregarious, he retired from the world, let the family business be run by outsiders, and immersed himself in books and poems. Perhaps things might have been better had my mother not died during the same outbreak, leaving me behind at the tender age of 4. The smallpox passed me by with only 1 scar behind my left ear. At the time, a fortune teller predicted that I would be lucky, but perhaps he was simply being optimistic. Yes, it is you that they want. Why me? All I know is that they asked if I had a daughter named Li Lan, and if you were married yet. Well, I don't think it would suit me at all. I scrubbed fiercely at the ink on the table, as though I could wipe away the topic of conversation. And how had they known my name? I was about to ask when my father said, "What, you don't want to be a widow at almost 18? Spend your life in the Lim mansion wearing silk, but you probably wouldn't be allowed any bright colours." He broke into his melancholy smile. Of course I didn't accept. How would I dare? Though if you didn't care for love or children, it might be not so bad. You would be housed and clothed all the days of your life. Are we so poor now? I asked. Poverty had been looming over our household for years, like a wave that threatened to break. Well, as of today, we can no longer buy ice. You could buy a block of ice from the British store, packed tightly in sawdust and wrapped in brown paper. It was a cargo remnant, having come by steamer all the way from halfway around the world, where clean ice was stowed in the hold to preserve fresh food. Afterward, the blocks were sold off to anyone who wanted a piece of the frozen West. My Amma told me how in earlier days my father had brought her a few exotic fruits for my mother, a handful of apples and pears grown under temperature skies. I had no recollection of such events, though I loved to chip at our occasional purchases of ice, imagining that I too had journeyed to the frigid wastes. I left him to the rest of his opium pipe. As a child, I spent hours standing in his study, memorizing poetry or grinding ink for him to practice his calligraphy, but my embroidery skills were poor, and I had little idea of how to run a household. All things that would make me a better wife. My Amma did what she could, but there were limits to her knowledge. I often used to fantasize about what life would be like had my mother lived. As I left the room, Amma pounced on me. She had been waiting outside and gave me quite a fright. What was it your father wanted to ask you? My Amma was very tiny and old. She was so small that she almost like a child, a very opinionated and despotic one, who nonetheless loved me with all her heart. She was my mother's nurse before me, and by rights should have retired long ago, but still she pottered around the house in her black trousers and white blouse like a clockwork toy. Nothing, I said. Was it a marriage offer? For someone who claimed to be old and deaf, she had surprisingly sharp hearing. A cockroach couldn't skitter across a dark room without her stamping it out. Not really, as she looked unconvinced, I said. It was more like a joke. A joke? Since when has your marriage been a joke? Marriage is very important to a woman. It determines her whole future, her life, her children. But this wasn't a real marriage. A concubine? Someone wants you to be his concubine? She shook her head. No, little miss, you must be a wife. Number one wife, if possible. It was not to be a concubine. Then who was it from? The Lim family. Her eyes widened until she resembled one of the secure-eyed jungle lemurs. The Lim family? Oh, little miss, it was not for nothing that you were born as beautiful as a butterfly. And so on and so forth. I listened with some amusement and irritation as she continued to list many good qualities that she had never bothered to mention to me before, until she came to an abrupt halt. Didn't the son of the Lim family die? There is a nephew, though. He will inherit, I suppose. No, it was a proposal for the son, I said with some reluctance, feeling as though I was betraying my father by admitting he had even entertained such an outrageous thought. Her reaction was just as expected. What could my father be thinking? How dare the Lims insult our family? Don't worry, Amma, he's not going to accept. You don't understand. This is very unlucky. Don't you know what it means? Her small frame quivered. Your father should never have mentioned this to you, even as a joke. I'm not upset, I crossed my arms. Aya, if only your mother were here. Your father has gone too far this time. Despite my attempts to reassure Amma, I felt uneasy as I went to bed, shielding my lamp against the flickering shadows. Our house was large and old, and since our financial decline had not had 1/10 of the servants needed to fully staff it, in my grandfather's day it was filled with people. He had a wife, 2 concubines, and several daughters. The only surviving son, however, was my father. Now the wives were dead and gone. My aunts were married off long ago, and my cousins, whom I had played with as children, had moved to Penang when that side of the family relocated. As our fortunes dwindled, more and more rooms were shuttered up. I seemed to recall the bustle of guests and servants, but that must have been before my father withdrew from the world and allowed himself to be cheated by his business partners. Amma occasionally talked about those times, but she always ended up cursing my father's folly, his wicked friends, and ultimately the god of smallpox, who allowed all this to happen. I was not sure that I believed in a god of smallpox. It didn't seem right to me that a god should stoop himself to go around blowing smallpox and through windows and doors at people. The foreign doctors at the hospital talked about this disease and quarantining outbreaks, an explanation that seemed far more reasonable to me. Sometimes I thought I would become a Christian, like the English ladies who went to the Anglican church every Sunday. I had never been, but it had looked so peaceful from the outside, and their graveyard, with its neat green sward and tidy gravestones on the frangipani trees, seemed a far more comfortable place than the wild Chinese cemeteries perched on hillsides. We went to the cemetery on Kunming, the festival of the dead, to sweep the graves, honour our ancestors, and offer food and incense. The graves were made like small houses, or very large armchairs, with wings on either side to encompass a central tablet and small altar. The paths up the hills were overgrown with weeds and lalang, the sharp elephant grass that cuts you if you run your fingers along it. All around were abandoned graves that people had forgotten, or which had no more descendants to care for them. The thought of having to pay my respects as the widow to a stranger made me shudder. And what exactly did marrying a ghost entail? My father had treated it as a joke. Amma had not wanted to say. She was so superstitious that naming something was as good as making it come true. As for myself, I could only hope that I would never need to know. Well, that's a good chapter. I'm going to have a sip of tea, and then we'll go on to chapter 2. Give me a second. I really hope that's audio. Hang on. I'm just going to check something. Is there audio? please be audio? Hey, there is audio. Perfect. Okay. Pull that too, and then I think in theory you should be able to see me a bit better. Yeah, perfect. Okay. Okay. Chapter 2. I tried my best to put the Lim's disturbing overture out of my mind. After all, it wasn't really what one would hope for in first proposal. I knew I ought to be married some day, a day that was drawing ever closer, but life was not yet too restrictive. Compared to how things were done in China, we were fairly casual in Malaya. Locally born Chinese women didn't bind their feet. Indeed, the other races looked upon feet binding as strange and ugly, crippling a woman and making her useless for work in the home. When the Portuguese first landed in Malacca more than 300 years ago, there were already Chinese here, though the earliest Chinese who came to seek their fortunes brought no woman. Some took Malaya wives, and the resulting mix of cultures was known as Peranakan. Later, settlers sent for women from home, who were often older, divorced or widows, for who else would undertake such a long and perilous voyage? So we were less rigid here, and even an unmarried girl of good family might walk in the streets, accompanied, of course, by a chaperone. In any case, despite my father's eternal interest in all things cultural from China, the reality was that the British were ruling of class here. They set the laws and precedents, established government offices, and opened English schools for natives. Bright young men aspired to be government clerks under them. I wondered what had happened to the unfortunate Lim Tian Cheng, and if he had hoped to rise to such a clerkship, or whether such things were beneath him as the son of a rich man. His father was well known as the owner of tin mining and concessions, as well as coffee and rubber plantations. I also wondered why the family had approached my father, for it wasn't as though I had any kind of personal history with their son. Over the next few days I tried to badger my father into revealing more of their conversations, but he refused to answer, retreating to his study, and, I am sure, smoking more opium than he ought. He had a vaguely sheepish air, as though he was sorry he had ever mentioned it. Amma also got on his nerves. Not daring to berate him openly, she wandered around with a feather duster, addressing various inanimate objects with a stream of muttered complaints. Unable to escape her onslaught, my father eventually placed a newspaper over his face and pretended to be asleep. In this way, I thought, the matter settled. However, a few days later a message came from the Lim family. It was an invitation from Madame Lim herself to play mahjong. "Oh, I don't play," I said before I could stop myself. The servant who had been sent merely smiled and said it didn't matter. I should still come and watch. Indeed, I was very curious to see the interior of the Lim mansion, and despite pulling a sour face, Amma could not help fussing over my clothes and hair. Meddling was always her second nature, and since I was much raised by her, I feared that it was also one of my own qualities. "Well, if you must go, at least they will say that you are nothing to be ashamed of," she said as she laid out my second best dress. I had two good dresses, one of thin lilac silk with morning glories embroidered on the colour and sleeves, and another of pale green with butterflies, both belonging to my mother, as I hadn't had new silk clothing for a while. Most of the time I wore loose cotton sheng sam, which is a long gown, or sam-fu, the blouse and trousers used by working girls. As it was, when these dresses were wore out, we would probably unpick the embroidered collars and cuffs to reuse on other garments. "What shall we do with your hair?" asked Amma, forgetting that she had disapproved of this visit only moments ago. My hair was usually kept in two neat plaits, though for special occasion it was skewered up with long hair pins. These gave me a headache, particularly when wielded by Amma, who was determined that not one strand should stray. Stepping back, she surveyed her handiwork and stuck in a couple of gold pins with jade butterflies. The hairpins were also my mother's. After that, she clasped no less than 5 necklaces around my neck, 2 of gold, 1 of garnets, another of small freshwater pearls, and the last with a heavy jade disc. I felt quite burdened by these largesse, but it was nothing compared to what wealthier people wore. Women had little security other than jewellery, so even the poorest among us sported gold chains, earrings, and rings as their insurance. As for the rich, well, I would soon see how Madame Lim was attired. The Lim mansion was further out of town, away from the close quarters of Jonker and Heron streets, where wealthy Chinese merchants had taken over old Dutch-chopped houses. I heard that the Lims too had such property, but they had moved their main residence to where the rich were building new estates in Klabang. It wasn't too far from our house, though I had heard it was nothing like the European quarters, villas and bungalows. Those were very grand indeed, with many servants, stables, and great expanses of green lawn. The Lim mansion was in the Chinese style and said to be quite imposing in its own right. Amma had called for a rickshaw to take us there, although I thought it was wasteful when we could have walked. She pointed out, however, that it was still a fair distance, and it would be no good to appear covered in sweat and dust. The afternoon sun had begun to abate when we set off. Waves of heat rose from the road, along with clouds of fine white dust. Our rickshaw puller moved at a steady trot, rivulets of sweat streaking his back. I felt sorry for those coolies who hired themselves out in this manner. It was a hard way to make a living, although better than working in the tin mines, where I had heard the mortality rate was almost 1 in 2. The rickshaw pullers were very thin, with concave rib cages, leathery skin, and bare feet so calloused that they resembled hooves. Still, the scrutiny of these strange men made me uneasy. Of course, I was not supposed to go out unaccompanied, and when I did, must shade my face with an oiled paper parasol. Before I could muse much further, however, we had drawn up in the Lim mansion. While Amma gave the rickshaw puller stern instructions to wait for us outside, I gazed at the heavy ironwood doors, which swung open noisily to reveal an equally silent servant. We passed through a courtyard lined with large porcelain pots planted with bougainvillea. The pots alone were worth a small fortune. I had been shipped from China, nestled in chests of tea leaves to protect against breakage. The blue and white glaze had the limpid quality that I had seen on the few small pieces that my father still possessed. If such costly ceramics were left out in the sun and rain, then I was certainly impressed. Perhaps that was the point. We waited in a grand foyer while the servant went ahead to announce us. The floor was black and white checkered, and the sweeping teak staircase had curved balustrades, and all around there were clocks. Such clocks! The walls were covered with dozens of clocks in every style imaginable. Large ones stood on the floor, and smaller examples nestled on side tables. There were cuckoo clocks, porcelain clocks, delicate or mellow clocks, and a tiny clock no larger than a quail's egg. Their glass faces shone, and the brass ornaments winked. All about us rose the hum of their works. Time, it seemed, would scarcely go unmarked in this house. While I was admiring this sight, the servant reappeared, and we were ushered through a further sequence of rooms. The house, like many Chinese mansions, was built in a series of courtyards and connecting corridors. We passed through stone gardens arranged like miniature landscapes and parlours stiff with antique furniture, until I heard the raised chatter of a woman's voice and the sharp clack of mahjong tiles. 5 tables had been set up, and I had an impression of well-dressed ladies who put my own attire to shame. But my eyes were fixed on the head table, where the servant muttered something to a woman who could only have been Madame Lim. At first glance I was disappointed. I had penetrated so far into this domain that I was expecting, perhaps naively, nothing less than the Queen of Heaven. Instead, she was a middle-aged woman with a figure that had thickened at the waist. She was dressed beautifully but severely in an inky hued baja panjong to signify mourning. Her son had died 9 months ago, but she would mourn him at least a year. She was almost overshadowed by the woman who sat next to her. She too wore blue and white mourning colours, but her stylish kabaya had a waspish cut, and her jewelled hairpins gave her an insect-like glitter. I would have thought that she was the lady of the house, except for the fact that she, like the other woman at the table, couldn't help but glance at Madame Lim as though to take their cue from her. I learned later that day that she was the 3rd wife. "I'm glad you could come," said Madame Lim. She had a soft voice, strangely youthful and much like the purring of a dove. I had to strain to hear her over the surrounding chatter. "Thank you, Auntie," I replied, for that was how we addressed old women as a mark of respect. I wasn't sure whether to bob my head or bow. How I wished I had paid more attention to such necessities. I knew your mother before she was married, when we were children, she said. She never mentioned it? Seeing my surprise, Madame Lim showed her teeth briefly in a smile. Your mother and I are distantly related. This I had never heard of either. I should have asked after you earlier, said Madame Lim. It was very remiss of me. Around her the mahjong game started up again, with a brisk clatter. She gestured to a servant who pulled up a marble-topped stool beside her. Come, Li Lan, I hear that you don't play, but perhaps you'd like to watch. So I sat next to her, looking at her tiles while she made bids, and nibbling sweetmeats that issued in a never-ending stream from the kitchen. They had all my favourite kinds of kwa, the soft, streamy Nyona cakes made of glutinous rice flour stuffed with palm sugar or shredded coconut. There were delicate rolled biscuits called love letters, and pineapple tarts pressed out of rich pastry. Bowls of toasted watermelon seeds were passed around, along with fan slices of mango and papaya. It had been a long time since we had such an assortment of treats at home, and I couldn't help indulging myself like a child. From the corner of my eye I saw Amma shake her head, but here she was powerless to stop me. At length Amma disappeared to the kitchen to help out, and without her disapproving eye, I continued eating. Give me a second. From time to time, Madame Lim murmured something to me. Her voice was so soft, however, that I scarcely understood her. I smiled and nodded, all the while gazing around with undisguised curiosity. I rarely had the chance to go out in society. Had my mother lived, I might have sat beside her just like this, peering over her shoulder at the ivory tiles and soaking up gossip. These women peppered their conversations with sly references to important people and places. With nonchalance they mentioned what seemed to me astounding gambling debts. Madame Lim must have thought me simple, or at the very least unsophisticated. I caught her sharp pigeon eyes studying me from time to time. Strangely enough, this seemed to relieve her. Only much later did I understand why she was so pleased with my gauche performance. What happened? Odd. Around us, the ladies chattered and made bets. Jade bangles ringing as the tiles clattered. The third wife had moved to another table, which was a pity, since I would have liked to study her a little more. She was certainly handsome, though she had a reputation for being difficult, as Emma had earlier found out through servants' chatter. I saw no sign of a second wife, although I was told that Lim herself, as a rich man's prerogative, kept other minor concubines whom he had not bothered to marry. There were 4 daughters from the different wives, but no surviving sons. 2 had died in infancy, and the last, Lim Tian-ching, had been buried less than a year ago. I had wanted to ask Emma how he had died, but she was unwilling to discuss it, claiming there was no use having any interest in him, since I would never be married to him, as it was the only heir was Lim's nephew. Actually, he is the rightful heir, Emma had said on our way there. What do you mean? He's Lim's older brother's son. Lim himself is his second son. He took over the estate when his older brother died, but promised to bring up his nephew as his heir. As time went on, however, people said that maybe he didn't want to overlook his own children, but what's there to talk about anyway? Lim has no more sons of his own now. As I considered the web of relationships, I couldn't help feeling a frisson of excitement. It was a world of wealth and intrigue, much like the crudely printed romances that my father was so dismissive of. Of course, Ahmed disapproved. I knew, however, that she too was secretly enthralled. It was so different from our own penurious household. How depressing it was to think of how we scraped along year by year, always trying to stretch things and never buying anything pretty or new. The worst was that my father never did anything. He no longer went out to make contracts or run his business. He had given all that up and was walked up in his study, endlessly copying his favourite poems and writing obscure treatises. Lately, I felt that we were all penned up with him too. I'm going to finish my tea. Give me a sec. Okay. You look sad, Madame Lim's voice broke in on me. Nothing seemed to escape her gaze. Her eyes were light for a Chinese, and the pupils small and round, like the eyes of a bird. I coloured. This house is so lively compared with my own home. You like it here? She asked. I nodded. Tell me, she said, do you have a sweetheart? No. I stared fixedly at my hands. Well, she said, a young girl shouldn't be too worldly. She gave me one of her abbreviated smiles. My dear, I hope you're not offended that I ask you so many questions. You remind me so much of your mother, and also myself when I was younger. I refrained from asking her about her own daughters. There were a few young women at the other tables, but everyone had been introduced to me in such a cursory manner that I had a hard time keeping track of who was cousin, friend, or daughter. The mahjong game continued, but as I wasn't a player, I began to feel restless after a while. When I excused myself to use the washroom, Madame Lim beckoned a servant to escort me. She was in the middle of an exciting hand, and I hoped she would stay that way for a while. The servant led me along various passages to a heavy Changel wood door. When I was done, I opened it a crack. My guide was still waiting patiently outside, but there was a cool down the hallway, and casting a quick glance at the door, she left to answer it. With a thrill, I slipped out. The house was built in a series of courtyards with rooms looking into them. I passed a small sitting room and then one with a marble table, half laid for a meal. Hearing voices, I turned hastily down yet another passageway into a courtyard with a small pond, where lotus flowers tilted their creamy heads amid green stalks. A sultry, dreamlike stillness settled over everything. I knew I ought to go back before I was missed, but still I lingered. While I was examining the lotus seed pods, which resembled the nozzles of watering cans, I heard a faint, silvery chime. Perhaps I was near the clockroom after all. Wandering over, I peered into what I looked like a study. One door was thrown open to the courtyard, but the interior was dark and cool. Momentarily blinded by the difference in the light, I stumbled against someone working at a low table. It was a young man dressed in shabby indigo cotton, cogs and gears scattered on the table and floor, rolling away into the corners. I'm sorry, miss, he glanced up with an apologetic air. I heard the chiming, I said awkwardly, helping him gather the pieces as best I could. You like clocks? I don't know much about them. Well, without this gear and this one, the clock stops completely, he said, collecting the shining innards of a brass pocket watch. With a pair of tweezers, he picked up two tiny cogs and laid them together. Oh, pardon me. Can you fix it? I really shouldn't be having this conversation with the young man, even if he was a servant, but he bent over his work, which put me at ease. I'm not an expert, but I can put it back together. My grandfather taught me. It's a useful skill, I said. You should open up your own shop. At that he looked up quizzically at me, then smiled. When he smiled, his thick eyebrows drew together, and his eyes crinkled at the corners. I felt my cheeks grow hot. Do you clean all the clocks? Sometimes. I also do a little accounting and I run errands. He was looking directly at me. I saw you beside the pond earlier. Oh, to hide my discomfort I looked away. Why are there so many clocks in this house? Some say it was a hobby, perhaps even an obsession with the old master. He was the one who collected all of them. He could never rest until he had acquired a new specimen. Why was he so interested in them? Well, mechanical clocks are far more precise than water clocks that tell time by dripping water, or candles where you burn colour to mark hours. These Western clocks are so accurate that you can use them to sail with longitude, not just latitude. Do you know what that is? I did, as a matter of fact. My father had explained to me once how the sea charts were marked both horizontally and vertically. Couldn't we sail with longitude before? No, in the past the great sea routes were all latitude. That's because it's the easiest way to plot a course. But imagine you're far out at sea. All you have is a sextant and a compass. You need to know exactly what time it is so you can reckon the relative position of the sun. That's why these clocks are so wonderful. With them, the Portuguese sailed all the way from the other side of the world. Why didn't we do that? I asked. We should have conquered them before they came to Malaya. Oh, Malaya is just a backwater, but China could have done it. The Ming Sea captains sailed as far as Africa, using only latitude and pilots who knew the local waters. Yes, I said eagerly. I read that they had brought back a giraffe for the emperor, but he wasn't interested in barbarian lands. And now China is in decline, and Malaya just another European colony. His words had a faint tinge of bitterness, which made me curious because his hair was cut short with no shaved pate or long-hanging queue, the braid hair that many men still maintained even after leaving China. This was either a sign of extreme low class or rebellion against traditional practices, but he merely smiled. Still, there's a lot to learn from the British. There were many questions I wanted to ask him, but with a start I realised I had been gone too long, and no matter how polite he seemed, it was still improper to talk to a strange young man, even if he was only a servant. I must go. Wait, miss, do you know where you're going? I came from the mahjong party. Should I escort you back? He half rose from the desk, and I couldn't help noticing the ease of his clean-limbed movements. No. The more I thought about my behaviour, the more embarrassed I felt, and the more certain I was that I had been missed. I practically ran out of the room, darting down several passages. I found myself in yet another part of the house. Luck was with me, however. While I was standing there undecided, the same servant who had escorted me to the washroom reappeared. "Oh, miss," she said, "I just stepped away, and when I came back you were gone." "I'm sorry," I said, smoothing my dress. "I went astray." When we got back to the mahjong room, the game was still underway. I slipped into my seat, but Madame Lim hardly seemed to notice. From the number of tokens piled in front of her, she had been on a winning streak. After a while I made my polite goodbyes, but to my surprise Madame Lim rose to see me out. On our way back to the front door, we passed a servant arranging funeral goods to be burned in one of the courtyards. These were miniature effigies of wire and brightly coloured paper that were burned for the dead to receive in the underworld. Paper horses for the dead to ride on, ground paper mansions, servants, food, stacks of hell currency, carriages, and even paper furniture. It was a little unusual to see these goods laid out now, as they were usually only prepared for funerals and Qingming, the festival of the dead. The devout could, however, also burn them at any time for the use of their ancestors, for without such offerings the dead were mere paupers in the afterworld, and without descendants or proper burial they wandered unceasingly as hungry ghosts and were unable to be reborn. It was only at Qingming, when general offerings were burned to ward off evil, that these unfortunates received a little sustenance. I had always thought it was a frightening idea, and looked askance at the funeral goods, despite the gay-coloured paper and the beautifully detailed models. As we walked, I studied Madame Lim covertly. The brightness of the courtyard revealed shadows under her eyes and the loose flesh of her cheeks. She looked unutterably wary, although her posture denied such weakness. "And how is your father?" she said. "He is well, thank you. Has he made any plans for you?" I ducked my head. "Not that I know of. But you are of marriageable age. A girl like you must already have many offers." "No, auntie. My father lives quite a retired life. And we're not rich any more," I added to myself. She sighed. "I would like to ask you a favour." My ears pricked up, but it was strangely in a curse. "Do you think you could spare me that ribbon in your hair? I was thinking of matching it to make a new bajou." "Of course." I pulled the ribbon loose. It was nothing special. The colour was a common pink, but who was I to gainsay her? She grasped it with a hand that trembled. "Are you well, auntie?" I dared to ask her. "I've had trouble sleeping," she said in her small feathery voice, "but I think it will pass soon." As soon as we were ensconced in the rickshaw, Amma began to scold me. "How could you behave like that? Eating so much and mooning around, I couldn't tell which was larger, your eyes or your mouth. They must have thought you a goose." "Why didn't you charm her? Tell her clever stories and flatter her. Tch, you behave like a Campon girl, not the daughter of the Pan family." "You never said I was charming before," I said, stung by her remarks, though I was secretly relieved she had been helping in the kitchen when I took my extended walk around. "Charming? Of course you're charming. You could cut paper butterflies and recite poems before any of the other children on our street. I didn't tell you before because I didn't want you to be spoiled." This was typical Amma logic, but she was bursting with gossip from the kitchen and easily distracted, particularly when I asked her about Madame Lim's request for my ribbon. "Well, it's a funny thing to ask. She hasn't had new clothes made for months. Maybe when the period of mourning is over they'll arrange a marriage for the nephew." "He's not married yet?" "Not even betrothed. They said that the master should have arranged an alliance for him earlier, but he held back because he wanted to make a better marriage for his own son." "How unfair." "Aya, that's the way of this world. Now the son is dead, they feel guilty for not doing so. Also, they probably want to get another heir quickly. If the nephew dies, there'll be no one left to inherit. I was somewhat interested in the story, but my thoughts roamed back over the afternoon. Amma, who looks after the clocks in that house? The clocks? One of the servants, I should think. Why do you want to know? I was just curious. You know, the servants say that Madame Lim is very interested in you, she said. She's been asking lots of questions lately about you and our household. Could it be about the ghost marriage? For some reason, the pearls of funeral effigies rose to my mind, and I shudders. Nobody knows about that, Amma was indignant. Indignant. It was a private conversation with your father. Maybe he even misunderstood all that opium he smokes. However much father smoked, I doubted that it had clouded his understanding that day, but I merely said, Madame Lim has been asking me questions too. What sort of questions? Whether I have a sweetheart, whether I'm betrothed yet? Amma looked as pleased as a cat that has caught a lizard. Well, the Lim family has so much money that perhaps a good upbringing matters more than family fortune. I tried to point out to her that it seemed unlikely they would pass up this chance to acquire a rich daughter-in-law in favour of me. It also didn't explain the unease I felt around Madame Lim, but Amma was happily off in her own daydreams. We should show you off more. If people know that the Lim family is interested in you, you might get other marriage offers. Amma was so sure in some ways. She would have made an excellent poultry dealer. We'll buy some cloth tomorrow to make you new clothes. That's the end of chapter 2. I'm gonna look and see where. Awesome. I'm gonna read up to chapter 5. And then I'm gonna stop, because I'm not sure when food will be. Or I might read chapter 5, depending on how I feel. I'm opening this now, because it's getting a bit dark. Chapter 3. That night I went to bed early, feeling tired and overexcited. It was hot and I tugged at the wooden shutters. Amma did not like me to open the windows too wide at night. Something about the night air being unwholesome. But then there was no monsoon, it could be stifling. When the oil lamp was blown out, the moonlight slowly strengthened until the room was filled with a pale, cold radiance. The Chinese considered a moon to be yin, feminine, full of negative energy, as opposed to the sun that was yang and exemplified masculinity. I liked the moon. With its soft silver beams, it was at once elusive and filled with trickery, so that lost objects that had rolled into the crevices of a room were rarely found, and books read in its light seemed to contain all sorts of fanciful stories that were never there the next morning. Amma said I must not sew by moonlight. It might ruin my eyesight, thus jeopardizing the chance of a good marriage. If I were married, I wouldn't mind if my husband were like the young man I'd met that day. Endlessly, I replayed our brief conversations, remembering the tones of his voice, the quick confidence in his remarks. I liked how seriously he had spoken to me, without the avuncular condensations of my father's few friends. The thought that he might share my interests or even understand my concerns caused a strange flutter in my chest. If I were a man and I found a serving girl who pleased me, no one would stop me from buying her if she was indentured. Men did so every day. It was far more difficult for women. There were stories of unfaithful concubines who had been strangled, who'd had their ears and noses sliced off, and were then left to roam the streets as beggars. I didn't know anybody personally to whom these atrocities had happened, but I could not meet this young man, or, worse still, fall in love with him. Even my father, lax as he was unlikely to allow a match with a servant. I sighed. I barely knew him. It was all hope and conjecture, though if I did marry, my husband was likely to be a stranger to me as well. It was not necessarily so for all girls of good family. Some families had an early betrothal, others entertained often enough that young people could meet and even fall in love. Not our household, however. My father's withdrawal from the world meant that he had sought out no friends with sons and had arranged no match for me. With the first time I began to fully comprehend why Amma was continually angry with him on the subject. The contrast between the realization of his neglect and the fondness I had for my father was painful. I had few marriage prospects and would be doomed to the half-life of spinsterhood. Without a husband, I would sink further into a genteel poverty, bereft of even the comfort and respect of being a mother. Faced with those depressing thoughts, I buried my face in my thin cotton pillow and cried myself to sleep. That night I had a curious dream. I wandered through the Lim mansion, though all was still and silent. It was bright, but there was no sun, merely the whiteness that came from a fog at midday, and, like a fog, parts of the house seemed to vanish as I passed, so that the way behind was shrouded in a thin white film. Just as I had that very day, I passed through artfully planted courtyards, dim corridors and echoing reception rooms, although this time there was no distant murmurs of voices nor servants moving about. Presently I became aware that I was not alone. Someone was following me, watching from behind a door, peering through the balustrades of the upper level. I began to hurry, turning down passage after passage that began to resemble one another with a dreadful sameness. At last I came into a courtyard with a lotus pond, very much like the one I had visited that day, although the flowers here had an artificial air, as though they had been stuck in the mud like so many sticks of incense. As I stood wondering what to do, someone sidled up beside me. Turning, I saw a strange man. He was grandly dressed in an old-fashioned formal robe that came down to his ankles. On his feet, curiously short and broad, he wore black cork shoes with pointed toes. His clothing were dried and lurid hues, but his face was quite undistinguished, being plump with a weak chin and a smattering of acne scars. He gazed at me with a solicitous smile. "Li Lan," he said, "how I've longed to see you again." "Who are you?" I asked. "You don't remember me, do you?" "It was too long ago, but I remember you. How could I forget?" he said with a flourish. "Your beautiful eyebrows like moths, your lips like hibiscus petals." As he beamed, I was struck by a lurch of nausea. "I want to go home." "Oh no, Li Lan," he said. "Please sit down. You don't know how long I've been waiting for this moment." As he gestured, a table appeared laden with all kinds of food. Boiled chickens, melons, candied coconuts, cakes of all possible varieties. Like his clothes, they were intensely and unappetizingly pigmented. The oranges looked like dabs of paint, while a platter of pandan cakes was the sickly hue of a sea before a typhoon. Piled up in a rigid pyramid, this largesse looked uncomfortably like funeral offerings. He pressed me to have a cup of tea. "I'm not thirsty," I said. "I know you're shy," said this maddening creature, "but I pour myself a cup. See, isn't it delicious?" He drank with every evidence of enjoyment. "Li Lan, my dear, don't you know who I am? I'm Lim Ching," he said, "the heir of the Lim family. I've come to court you." The queasiness continued to build until I felt lightheaded. "Aren't you dead?" As soon as I said it, the world contracted as though it had been wrinkled. The colours muted, the outline of the chairs blurred. Then, like the snap of a gutta-percha string, everything was back the way it had been. The white light shone and the food on the table positively glowed. Lim Ching closed his eyes as though pained. "My dear," he said, "I know this is a shock to you, but let's not dwell on that." I shook my head doggedly. "I know you're a delicate creature," he said. "I don't wish to distress you. We'll try again another time." He tried to smile as he faded away. I was forcing myself awake with all the will I could muster. It was like struggling with a mangrove swamp, but slowly the colours bled away until, gasping, I was aware of the moonlight spilling over my pillow and a numbness in my hands from where I pressed my forehead. I could hardly sleep the rest of the night. My body was covered in sweat, my heart racing. What I really wanted to do was go into the hallway and crawl, like a child, into Alma's bed. I used to sleep next to her when I was small, and the pungent smell of the white flower oil she dabbed on her temples against headaches comforted me. If I went now, however, Alma would be worried. I would get a scolding and she would force all sorts of nostrums on me. Still, the loneliness and terror I felt almost drove me to disturb her until I remembered that she was incurably superstitious woman, and any mention of Lim Ching would upset her for days. Toward dawn, I fairly fell into an uneasy torpor. I meant to tell Alma about the dream, but my fears seemed less consequential in bright sunlight. It was a result of dwelling on the Lim family, I told myself, or eating too much rich food. I also didn't want to admit to Alma that I had been thinking about my husbands before I went to bed. The whole encounter with the young man who had fixed clocks made me feel guilty. The next evening I went to bed with trepidation, but there was no dreams, and so when a few more uneventful nights passed, I put it behind me. My thoughts were, in any case, more concerned with another. Try as I might, they kept drifting back to my conversations with the clock cleaner. I thought about how knowledgeable he had seemed, and what a pity that such a man should be a servant. I wondered how it would feel to run my hands through his cropped hair. When I had a free moment, I studied the angles of my face in the small lacquer mirror that had been my mother's. Growing up, my father took little notice of my appearance. He was more interested in my opinions on paintings and the liveliness of my brush calligraphy. Occasionally he mentioned that I resembled my mother, but the observation seemed to give more pain than pleasure, and afterwards he would withdraw. My Amma seldom praised and often found fault, yet I knew she would throw herself under an ox cart for me. Amma, I asked her some days later, how was my mother related to Madame Lin? We were walking home after buying material for a new dress. Somehow Amma had found the money for it. Embarrassed, I couldn't bring myself to ask from what private store she had scrimped this unnecessary luxury. All Amma put aside their wages for their retirement. They were a special class of servants, sometimes known as black and white, because of the cloths they wore. A white Chinese blouse over black cotton trousers. Some were single women who refused to marry. Others childless widows with no other means of support. When they became Ammas, they cut their hair into a short bob and joined a special sisterhood. They paid their dues and banked their money there, and in return, after a lifetime of work for others, passed their old age in the association house where they were fed and clothed until the end of their days. It was one of the few options for a woman with no family and no children to take care of her in her dotage. I suspected that Amma had been raiding her own savings for me. It was shameful. If our family really ran out of money, then she ought to look for another position, or she could simply retire. She was old enough to do so. If I married well, she might come with me as my personal maid, just she had come with my mother upon her marriage. Now, as I glanced at her tiny form trotting beside me, I felt a surge of affection. Despite her exasperating strictures, which often made me wish to escape her control, she was fiercely loyal. Your mother and Madame Lim were second or third cousins, I believe, she said, but Madame Lim talked as though she knew my mother. Perhaps, but I don't think they were close. I would have remembered, she said. Madame Lim was a daughter of the Yong family. They made their money building roads for the British. She said they played together as children. Did she? Maybe a couple of times, but she wasn't one of your mother's close friends, that's for sure. Why would she say such a thing, then? Who knows what a rich Tai-Tai thinks? Amma smiled suddenly, her face wrinkling like a tortoise. I'm sure she has her reasons, though. The servants say it isn't a bad household. Of course, they're still in mourning for the son. It was a great loss for them when he died last year. Does she have other children? 2 other sons died in infancy. There are daughters by the second and third wives, though. I saw the third wife, but not the second one. She died 4 years ago of malaria. Malaria was a scourge for us in Malaya, a constant fever in people's veins. The Malayas burned smoky fires to keep the disease away, and the Hindus garlanded their many gods with wreaths of jasmine and marigold to protect them. The British said, however, that it was borne by mosquitoes. Thinking about insects reminded me of the third wife and her glittering jewelled pins. The third wife looks difficult, I said. That woman, she was nobody when the master married her. No one even knew where she came from. Some town far south, maybe Johore or even Singapore. Did the wives get along? Only rich men could afford many wives, and the customs was becoming infrequent. The British frowned on it. From what I heard, it was the womenfolk, the mems, who were most against it. Naturally, they disapproved of their men acquiring mistresses and going native. I couldn't say that I blamed them for it. I too would hate to be a second wife, or a third or fourth. If that were the case, I would run away and pledge my life to the Amma Association. As well as you could expect, and then there's all that vying to see who can produce an heir. Fortunately for Madame Ling, she seems to have been the only one. And the son, Lim Tianqing, what was he like? I shivered despite the heat of the day, remembering my dream. Amma usually avoided speaking of him, but I thought I would see what I could worm out of her today. Spoiled, I heard. I think so too. I blurted this out without thinking, but she didn't notice. They said he wasn't as capable as the nephew Aya. Nope. They said he wasn't as capable as the nephew. Aya, no point discussing him. Better not speak ill of the dead. Chapter 4. I wonder whether or not... I don't know. I reckon the clockmaker is a ghost, but I'm not sure. Emma's foresight in preparing a new dress was proven right when a few days later I received another invitation to the Lim mansion. This time my father was invited as well. In honour of the upcoming Double Seventh Festival, it was to be a musical gathering with a private performance for family and friends. There were not many public venues for entertainment that women of good family could repair to, so from time to time soirs were held at home. Emma had often told me about how the main courtyard in our house would be cleared and how my grandfather hired men to build a temporary stage. Needless to say, such occasions have been non-existent in recent years, so I was much excited at this prospect. My father had consented to go. Master Lim had been part of his previous circle of business contacts, and their relationship, though sporadic, was still cordial. Truly, I wasn't very certain with whom my father was still in touch. Sometimes he surprised me. The seventh day of the 7th month was a festival to celebrate two heavenly lovers, the cowherd and heavenly maid. Emma told me this tale when I was small. A long time ago there was a cowherd who had nothing but an old ox to keep him company. One day the ox suddenly spoke and told him that he might win himself a wife if he hid beside a pool and waited for their heavenly weaving maidens. As they bathed, the cowherd hid one set of clothes, and when one of the maidens was left behind searching for her garments, he accosted her and asked her to be his wife. Eventually, the magic ox died. At this point, I always burst in with questions. Emma would brush aside my protests, continuing her well-worn tale. She was a pedantic storyteller who repeated her stories in exactly the same words each time. When the magic ox died, it told the cowherd to keep its skin for a time of great need, and soon enough the Queen of Heaven was angered that one of her best weavers had married a mortal, and commanded that she be brought back to heaven. In despair, the cowherd followed his wife on the magic ox skin, bearing their two children in baskets at the end of a pole. To prevent him from catching up, the Queen of Heaven took her hairpin and drew a river, the Milky Way, between them in the heavens. On one day each year, however, the magpies of the earth took pity on the lovers and made a bridge so they could cross to see each other. This was the conjunction of the two stars, Altair and Vega, on the 7th day of the 7th month. When Emma told me the story, I couldn't understand why such a tragedy was considered a festival for lovers. There was no happy ending, only endless waiting on each side of the river. It seemed like a miserable way to spend eternity. Instead, I was more interested in the ox. How did the ox know that the heavenly maidens were coming? Why could it speak? And most of all, why did the ox have to die? Emma never gave me very much satisfactory answers to these questions. The point of the story is the lovers, you silly child, she said, and indeed the festival was particularly suited for young girls who took part in competitions to thread a needle by moonlight, bathed their faces with flower water, and sang songs to celebrate needlework. I had never had a chance to take part in these maidenly activities, however, because the other thing that was celebrated on the Double Seventh Festival was the sunning of the books. The 7th day of the 7th month was also considered a particularly fortuitous time to air old books and scrolls, and as my father had vast quantities of both, this was our major activity during the festival. Tables were placed in the courtyard and his collections were laid out in the sun, papers turned to ensue even drying. A careful watch must be kept to ensure the ink would not fade. I still remember the smooth, hot feeling of the paper beneath my palms and the brilliance of the colours intensified by the sun. Our climate was hot and damp, an adverse environment for libraries. Many times I would find that silverfish or bookworms had begun to consume the paper, and I would be set to tracing the wormholes to get rid of the pests. That was why my memories of the Double Seventh Festival was inextricably linked to the smell of mouldy paper. This year would be different, though. I suspected that the Lims would celebrate in a far grander fashion. The performance was in the afternoon, to be followed by a dinner afterward. I spent the morning laying out what few pieces of good jewellery I had. Emma pressed the new dress with a heavy charcoal iron until it was smooth and crisp. I rarely wore a kebaya, but I wish I did so more often because it was very flattering. The baju, or shirt, was fitted at the waist and made of sheer white cotton with cutwork and embroidery down the front and edges. The front of the baju was fastened with 3 gold brooches, shaped like flowers and attached to one another by fine gold chains, while the ankle-length sarong was made of fine batik and a curling pattern of green leaves and pink and yellow flowers. When I had bathed and dressed, and Amma put my hair up, I barely recognised myself. But as I gazed at my reflection, it seemed as though there was someone in the corner of the room watching me. Glancing round, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, yet in the mirror I had the distinct impression of a figure standing near the large wardrobe. Uneasily, I continued to stare into its depths. Amma came in as I was doing so and caught my anxious looks. "Why so sour? No one will marry you if you pull a face like that." I didn't have the heart to tell her that I thought I had seen someone in the mirror, so I put on a smile, although my pleasure in my appearance was quite dampened after that. At the entrance hall of the Lim mansion, I had my first glimpse of the master of the house. Lim Taek-yong was short and inclined to a certain porky affluence, but he had an imposing personality. He greeted my father warmly and studied me with interest. "So this is your daughter," he said. "Where have you been hiding her?" My father smiled and murmured something non-committal, glancing around the reception room with an air of familiarity. He must have been here many times before when my mother was alive, I realised. I didn't have much time to observe, however, before I was sent off for refreshments with the ladies. In accordance with Islam, the upper-class Malayas kept their ladies in a purdah, and no men with other than immediate family members were allowed to glimpse them unveiled. The local Chinese did not observe such strict segregations of the sexes, though too much intimacy between young people was discouraged. The house was full of people. Children ran underfoot with an air of excitement, reminding me of my own childhood, when my cousins and I had raced around the courtyards of our house, but my cousins had long gone to Penang, together with my two aunts when their husbands had relocated. I had only sporadic letters from them, especially since 3 of them had already married. Servants passed swiftly, bearing trays. I looked around to see whether I recognised any of them, but the one I sought wasn't there. A stage had been set up in the main courtyard. "I heard a famous opera singer will give a private performance today," one young matron told me. She had a face like a floured dumpling. It bore a kind expression. I had been introduced to her before, but could not remember her name. "You're Li Lan, aren't you?" she said. "I'm Yan Hong, the eldest daughter of the house." As I stammered my apologies for forgetting her name, she smiled. "Now that I'm married, I don't live here anymore, but I come back from time to time to help out and show off the grandchildren." "How many children do you have?" I asked. 3, she said, rubbing the small of her back. "My eldest is already 7, but the younger 2 are barely walking." Just then Madame Lim passed us. "The performance won't start for a little while," she said. "Why don't you get some refreshments?" She still looked ill to me, although she had applied a little rouge to her sallow complexion. "Is your mother all right?" I asked Yan Hong. Yan Hong laughed. "She's not my mother. My mother was the second wife. It's hard for me to get used to a household with so many people." "Your father has only one wife?" she asked. "Yes, he never remarried." "You're lucky. I suppose it would have been strange to have a stepmother or 2. But then Yan Hong didn't know my father and how the god of smallpox had stripped him of almost everything he had. "My father lost interest in life after my mother died," I said. "We never have as many people over as this." Yan Hong grimaced. "It's a good show, isn't it? But I never want to be a second wife. If my husband thought about remarrying, I would leave him." "Would you?" Suddenly I wondered at her confidence. But then she was from a rich and powerful family. Presumably that gave her a certain amount of clout with her husband. "I'm frightening you. Marriage isn't so bad, and my husband is a good man. If you can believe it, I was madly in love with him," she said. "They didn't want me to marry him because he was too poor, but I knew he was clever. He got a scholarship from his clan association and went to Hong Kong to study with my cousin." I looked at her with new interest. I knew that some of the sons of rich men went abroad to Hong Kong and even England to study. I came back as doctors or lawyers. Had I been a boy, I would have liked to do so too, and I said as much to her. "Oh, I don't know," she said. "The voyage can be dangerous because of the typhoons, and once you're there, life can be difficult." She looked as though she was about to say something further, but pressed her lips together. I had heard about the unrest in Hong Kong, despite its British rule, and was curious as to what she meant, but she merely said that her husband had studied at the new Hong Kong College of Medicine, founded by the London Missionary Society. "Come," said Yan Hong, "let's find something to eat." We wandered toward a large inner room from which issued the sounds of musicians playing. I was transfixed by the music. The erhu was a 2-string Chinese violin played with a horsehair bow. The strings were steel and the resonator cover made of python skin. It had a peculiarly haunting quality, like a voice singing. The small ensemble here was playing folk music, and the tunes were traditional and lively. "You like erhu music?" said Yan Hong. "Yes, I do. A blind musician used to play in the street near our house, and the melancholy sound of its instrument had always exemplified dusk and yearning to me. The performers today were two erhu players, and one Yang Qin player who accompanied them on their hammered dulcimer. To my surprise, one of the erhu players was none other than the young man who had been repairing clocks. Seated on a low stool with his instrument held vertically before him, his fingers flew over the neck while his other arm plied the horsehair bow. Despite his loose-fitted cotton gown, I could see the square breadth of his shoulders as he leaned over the instrument and how his torso tapered to narrow hips. I must have been staring for quite a while when I realised that Yan Hong had asked me a question. "I'm sorry," I said. "I was listening to the music." She looked amused. "Listening or looking?" I flushed. "They're quite good, don't you think?" "Yes, for amateurs. My father enjoys music and encourages his household to play." "Who are they?" "The old erhu player is my third uncle, and that's his son on the Yang Qin. The other player is my cousin." "Cousin?" I looked down to hide my confusion. My heart was beating like a drum. The music ended, but I could still hear the blood rushing through my ears. Embarrassed, I selected a large and sticky anku, a steamed red cake stuffed with yellow bean paste, and bit into it. When I looked up again, he was standing next to Yan Hong. "Li Lan, this is my cousin, Tian Bei." We did not shake hands as I had heard the British do, but under his gaze I felt a flicker run through my veins. "In addition to cleaning the clocks, I also play a little music," he said. Yan Hong looked at him with amusement. "What are you talking about?" Turning to me, she said, "Li Lan is the daughter of the Pan family." I tried to swallow my cue, but it was sticky and clung to my throat. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," I said with as much dignity as I could muster. "I'll get you some water," said Yan Hong, darting after a passing servant. There was a little crease at the corners of his eyes, exactly like the fold in a freshly laundered sheet. "I had a hard time finding out who you were," he said. "You just ran off the other day." "I was away too long." I was too embarrassed to admit I had thought he was a servant, but he had a horrible feeling that he knew anyway. "You don't like mahjong?" "I never learned to play. It seems like a waste of time." "It is. You have no idea how much money some of these women can gamble away." "What would you rather they spend their time on?" "I don't know. Books, maps, maybe clocks." I hardly dared to look him in the eye, yet I was drawn to his gaze like a moth to a flame. It wouldn't do to appear silly and empty-headed. A man who had travelled across the ocean must surely be bored by small talk. He gave no sign of it, though, asking me what books I had read and what I knew about the sea charts. "The world is almost mapped," he said. "There are a few places still unknown, the depths of the African continent, the poles, but the vast land masses are charted now. You sound more like an explorer than a doctor." He laughed. "Did Yang Hong tell you that? I'm afraid that I never finished my medical degree, although her husband did. My uncle called me back before I was done, but it's true I would have preferred to be an explorer. That's not a very Chinese sentiment. China had eschewed sea voyages in the past, disdaining contact with barbarian peoples and only interested in her own affairs. China was the centre of the universe, as even we overseas Chinese were taught. The British were amazed at the speed at which news of China's affairs reached us in this far-off colony. The clan associations had corps on fast junks, and they regularly exchanged information before the British, with their spies and settlements in Cantons and Peking, could do so." "Maybe I'm still filial then," he said with a smile. "People have often complained about that." "Complained about what?" Yan Hong reappeared with a cup of water for me. "About my disobedience," he said. She knit her brows in a mock annoyance. "You've been talking to Miss Pan for too long. The performance is beginning and Father is looking for you. Hurry up or he'll never be able to arrange the seating properly." I wish I could remember more of the operatic performance. I'm told it was quite good. A well-known troupe was in town and hired to give a private performance. They did a few scenes from the opera about the cowherd and the weaving maid, but I hardly paid attention. From where I sat among the women, I tried surreptitiously to catch a glimpse of Tian Bei. I could see his uncle, Lim Tek Yong, sitting in front with a number of important-looking gentlemen, but he wasn't with them. Finally, I caught sight of him in the back, arranging additional seating for some late guests. No wonder he was considered useful in the household. He had his life changed since Lim Cheng, the son of the house, had died the past year. Thinking about the dead man gave me an oppressive feeling, as though the air had curdled in my lungs. My father was very dismissive about things. The ghosts and dreams he would often quote Confucius, who had said it was better not to know about ghosts and God, but rather to focus on the world we lived in. Still, thoughts of Lim Cheng cast a pall over the proceedings. I hardly saw the actors as they leapt and postured before me, faces elaborately painted and embroidered costumes quivering with feathers. When I raised my head again, I caught Tian Bei's eye from across the courtyard. He gave me an unreadable look. The dinner that followed the performance was of the first quality. Even the rice was this year's new crop, the grains chewy and tender. At home we bought only old rice because it was drier and you could get more rice per catty. I would have been content eating only the white rice, but there was many other delicacies to sample. Steamed pomfret, the silvery size of the fish veiled in soy sauce and shallow oil. Fried pigeons, tender strips of jellyfish quivered under a sprinkling of sesame seeds, and I was delighted to see my favourite carubo, a dish of fiddled ferns dressed with shallots, chilies, and tiny dried shrimp in coconut milk. After dinner, there were games for the young ladies in the courtyard. The daughters of the house, together with their innumerable cousins, displayed their needlework, which was exquisite, and were complimented on their fair complexions. I stood shyly on the side. No one had told me about this, so I had brought nothing to show. In any case, my own sewing was very poor, and mostly restricted to mending things nowadays. There were so many people that I was sure that no one would care if I did not participate, but soon I heard Yan Hong calling, "Li Lan, come, join the needle threading competition." The lamps were blown out, and the silvery radiance of the moon permeated the courtyard, bathing everything in its pale glow. A table was set up with several stations of needles and threads. The unmarried girls would compete to see who could thread all their needles the fastest. As I took my place, I was jostled by my neighbour, a large-boned girl with horsey good looks. She gave me a cold glance, her eyes sliding me over dismissively. "Ready?" cried Yang Hong. "Ladies, start!" There were 5 needles in front of me, in varying thickness, from large to very fine. I quickly threaded the first 3, but the last 2 were more difficult. Girls sighed and complained coquettishly. In the wavering moonlight, the harder I squinted, the less I could see, so I used the tip of my fingers to feel for the hole, just as I had traced the pathways of insects and bookworms in my father's manuscript. The thread slipped through, and I waved my hands in excitement. "I'm done!" There were congratulations from the other girls. My horse-faced neighbour sighed and shrugged. I wondered what I had done to offend her, but soon forgot in the excitement. There were other games as well, lantern decorating and singing, and by the end of the evening I could not remember when I had enjoyed myself so thoroughly in recent times. As we were leaving the Lim mansion, my father glanced at my bright face. "Did you enjoy yourself?" he said. "Yes, father, indeed I did." He smiled sadly. "I forgot how quickly you've grown up. In my mind you're still a little girl. I should have arranged for you to mix more after your cousin Steph for Penang." I did not like to see the shadow pass over his face again. Tonight he had seemed quite cheerful and appeared to have enjoyed the performance. I once overheard Amma telling the cook that when my mother died, part of my father died too. She had spoken, no doubt, in a slight theatrical manner, but when I was younger I took her words literally. No wonder he sometimes drifted, as though the thin line that anchored him to the present was fraying away. When I was younger I often felt guilty when he seemed troubled. Of course, sons were better. Everyone said so. But I suspected that even if I had been a boy, I would not have been enough to console him for the loss of my mother. I'm now on chapter 5. I'm going to finish there, though. And because it's nearly tea time, and I'm thinking if I finish now, then it's less likely that I'll be called down halfway through. Yeah, I think it'll be less likely that I'll be called halfway through a chapter. I'm going to finish a chapter, so I'm going to stop it now, and then, yeah. But I don't know when I'll next
stream, hopefully soon, but I'll read more of it next time.